Hi, welcome to Season 5, Episode 4 of Everyday NLP Bites. If you've not been watching or listening to earlier podcasts, I'm Florence Madden. I'm an NLP trainer and coach based in Cumbria in the north of England. I'm also the author of The Intention Impact Conundrum and the co-author of Everyday NLP. I've entitled this season of podcasts, What Are You Saying? Because my focus is on language patterns. Everyday language patterns that perhaps we just don't notice they are so commonplace. And yet, what we say or what we write, our use of language is indicative of beliefs, thoughts, attitudes that we hold at a deeper level and sometimes unconsciously. And those attitudes or beliefs might well be getting in the way of our success and happiness, whatever that means to us. So it's useful to notice these patterns in ourselves and as appropriate in other people, to start to get back to what's actually factual and to allow us perhaps to reappraise situations or even our opinion of ourselves. Each week I'm taking a different language pattern, and the one that I've chosen to look at this week is where someone takes an event, an experience, something that happens, and extrapolates from that a fact that doesn't necessarily follow, or perhaps more accurately, an opinion that doesn't necessarily follow. This, in the NLP meta model, is known as a complex equivalence. And I often refer to this as putting 2 and 2 together and getting 15. An example of this is perhaps where someone says, I haven't been invited to that meeting. So it's clear they don't value my input. That's where somebody takes a fact that they haven't been invited to a meeting and they have made assumptions about what that fact represents, which may be true or it may not. The problem is that when we do that, we behave as if that assumption is true. And that causes problems for us, perhaps in our relationships, or perhaps even how we think about ourselves. In this season of podcasts, I've been looking out for these language patterns in conversations and in the media, and also inviting friends and associates to send me their examples. So this week, I'm indebted to my friend Mike Rollins, who has alerted me to a rather interesting complex equivalence when the Cabinet Minister, Gavin Williamson, was being interviewed. Gavin Williamson was asked in a radio interview about how we came to get such quick approval of the vaccine in this country. And his reply was this: well, I just reckon that we've got the best people in this country. We obviously got the best medical regulators, much better than the French have, much better than the Belgians have, much better than the Americans have. That doesn't surprise me at all, because we're a much better country than every single one of them. I suspect that many people watching or listening to this podcast wouldn't disagree that this is a great country. But the fact that he sees the country in that way and seems to think that we're better than everybody else does not necessarily explain why the vaccine was approved more quickly for this country. And okay, that has brought a certain amount of amusement in the press that Gavin Williamson got, let's say, a bit carried away in his thoughts. And yeah, that's the source of some passing amusement to us. When you actually take it into our everyday lives and our everyday experience, it takes on quite a different implication. When we take a fact and extrapolate from that something that doesn't necessarily follow, we could well be doing some damage to ourselves. This is called a distortion. Now, a distortion is one of the ways in which our brain manages the huge amount of information that's coming in. And how a distortion works is that as information comes in, the brain looks to fit it with information that it has already. An example of this is when you look up in the sky one of those days that is a lovely blue sky with white puffy clouds. If you look at those clouds long enough, then our brain starts to notice shapes that maybe they look like a house or a car or a face. It isn't any of those, of course, but the brain is looking to fit those abstract shapes with information that we already hold. That helps us in learning, because when we go to a conference or a meeting or a training course, the information coming into us is learned more easily by fitting it with what we know already. The problem comes when information coming into us is fitting, or we look to fit it with a narrative that isn't serving us. We are taking ourselves down a very narrow path that can actually be quite destructive. So in the example that I gave previously, if someone is not invited to a meeting and they extrapolate from that, the reason is that my opinion isn't valued, that's likely to be damaging to the relationships with those other people who called the meeting. And also it's damaging to our own self-esteem, or potentially so. So what do we do about it? Well, I suppose we need to separate the fact from the assumption. And we do this by asking ourselves the question, how does this mean that? How does the fact that I'm not invited to a particular meeting mean that my opinion is not valued? Now, if we think that may be the case, then I guess we may well be better going and speaking to the person who's calling that meeting and actually getting to the bottom of it, rather than make an assumption that might be destructive, as I say, either to our relationships or perhaps to ourselves. And of course, we can help other people in this way as well. So we can hear this pattern in their language and respectfully, when we hear it, ask them, how does this mean that? And perhaps get them to reconsider the assumptions that they're making also. I'd like to finish today on a quote from Jessamine West, who's an activist and a librarian. We want the facts to fit the preconceptions. When they don't, it's easier to ignore the facts than to change the preconceptions. And yet, if we ask ourselves the question, how does this mean that? Perhaps we can challenge the preconceptions and see ourselves, see situations, perhaps see other people in quite a different light. So thank you for watching or listening to this podcast. If you're watching this pre-Christmas, this is my last podcast before Christmas, and I wish you and your family a really, really happy Christmas. And I hope you will join me again in 2021 when these podcasts resume on the 9th of January. For now, thank you for watching or listening. Bye for now.